The Bering Sea doesn't forgive mistakes. It never has. But in 2023, something happened on the ocean floor that left scientists, fishermen, and government officials struggling for answers. Billions of snow crabs gone. An entire population, one of the most commercially valuable seafood species on the planet, had vanished from Alaska's waters almost overnight. Then came the other problem. While native stocks were collapsing in some zones, in others, the crabs weren't disappearing. They were spreading, moving into ecosystems they had never occupied before, disrupting food webs that had taken thousands of years to stabilize. The fishing industry was already in crisis. Now marine biologists were raising a different alarm. Something in the ocean had shifted, and the crabs were following it, outward, deeper, further than anyone had mapped. Alaska had faced invasive species before, but not like this. Not at this scale, not with this speed, and not while an entire coastal economy was already on the edge of collapse. What followed was one of the most complex marine management crises in modern American history. A story involving emergency fishery closures, desperate government interventions, industry collapse, and a scramble to understand what the ocean was becoming. This is how Alaska dealt with millions of invasive snow crabs, and why the answers they found were far more disturbing than the question. To understand what happened, you have to understand what snow crabs mean to Alaska. They aren't just seafood. They are an economy. For decades, the Bering Sea snow crab fishery generated hundreds of millions of dollars every single year. Entire coastal towns, Kodiak, Dutch Harbor, Nome, were built around the rhythm of crab season. Fishermen planned their lives around it. Families depended on it. And for a long time, the system worked. Then, somewhere around 2018, the numbers started shifting. Stock assessments, the surveys used to count crab populations, began returning unusual data. Not alarming. Not yet. Just off. Scientists noted it. Filed reports, ran the models again. The models kept showing the same thing. Population movement. Snow crabs were being recorded in zones they had rarely occupied before, further north, into shallower, warmer shelf waters. Marine biologists assumed it was a temporary thermal response, crabs moving away from warming bottom temperatures in their traditional range. A natural adjustment. What they didn't realize was that this wasn't a retreat. It was an advance. By 2020, survey vessels were pulling up crab counts in certain northern zones that didn't match any historical baseline. The density was wrong. Too many animals. Too concentrated. In the wrong place. One researcher later described it as finding a city where there should have been a village. And underneath that discovery was a question nobody had fully asked yet. If the crabs were here, in these numbers, what were they eating? The answer came slowly, and it was worse than anyone had anticipated. Snow crabs are opportunistic feeders. They consume worms, mollusks, smaller crustaceans, organic debris on the seafloor. In balanced ecosystems, their feeding is manageable. But when you concentrate millions of them into a zone that never evolved to absorb that pressure, the seafloor doesn't recover. It gets stripped. Marine survey teams working the northern shelf zones in 2021 began documenting something deeply unusual. Sections of seafloor that had previously supported dense communities of invertebrates, the foundational layer of the entire food web, were coming up nearly empty. Not reduced, not depleted. Empty. One survey diver later described dropping into a zone that looked like it had been scraped clean. No tube worms, no small bivalves, no brittle stars, just sediment and crabs, moving in slow, dense formations across the bottom. What was unfolding wasn't simply overpopulation. It was consumption at an industrial scale. And here was the twist that changed everything. The crabs weren't invasive in the traditional sense. They weren't a foreign species smuggled in from another continent. They were native to Alaskan waters. But native species, under the right pressure, can behave like invaders. Climate-driven displacement had pushed them into a role their ecosystem was never designed to support. They had become, functionally, a plague of their own making, and the fishing industry, already watching its quotas collapse, had no framework for dealing with that. No regulation covered this scenario. No emergency protocol had been written for it. The government was about to find that out the hard way. In October 2022, the National Marine Fisheries Service made an announcement that stopped the industry cold. The snow crab season was canceled entirely. For the first time in the modern history of the Bering Sea fishery, no quota, no harvest, no season, just a complete closure of one of America's most valuable marine industries. The economic shockwave hit immediately. Processing plants in Dutch Harbor went quiet. Fishing vessels that had spent hundreds of thousands of dollars preparing for the season sat idle at dock. Crew members who had traveled from across the country, some from as far as the Pacific Northwest, had no work to return to. The closure was framed as a conservation measure, a necessary pause to allow the population to stabilize. But inside the scientific community, the conversation was far more uncomfortable, because the data wasn't showing a population that needed rest. It was showing a population that had been restructured. The crabs hadn't simply declined in their traditional zones. They had redistributed, concentrated into areas where they were ecologically destabilizing and simultaneously absent from the zones that the entire fishing economy was built around. You couldn't fish the new zones safely without destroying them further. And you couldn't fish the old zones because there was nothing left to catch. The industry was trapped between two disasters at once. Then a group of independent marine researchers released a paper that reframed the entire crisis. They argued the crab displacement wasn't random. It was directional, driven by a specific and measurable shift in bottom water temperatures that was accelerating, not stabilizing. Which meant the crabs weren't done moving. They were still going, and nobody knew where they would stop. The temperature data was undeniable. Between 2018 and 2022, bottom water temperatures in the southeastern Bering Sea had spiked in ways that had no modern precedent. Not gradually, not incrementally. In sudden, sustained surges, the cold pool, a dense layer of near-freezing water that sits on the Bering Sea shelf every summer, had shrunk dramatically. Snow crabs depend on that cold pool. It is their barrier, their boundary, their thermal anchor. When it contracted, they followed it north, all of them, at once. Millions of animals driven by a single environmental signal into a shelf system that couldn't absorb them. And as researchers dug deeper into the mortality data, they found something that hadn't been part of the public conversation yet. The crabs weren't just displacing. They were starving, compressed into overcrowded zones, competing for a food supply that was already being exhausted by their own density. The population had begun cannibalizing itself, larger males consuming smaller ones, a behavior documented in lab settings but rarely observed at this scale in the wild. The ecosystem wasn't just being disrupted from the outside, it was collapsing from within. Federal fisheries managers convened emergency sessions. Options were discussed. Interventions were proposed. Some researchers pushed for a controlled, limited harvest in the over-concentrated zones, not for commercial gain, but as a population management tool. Reduce the density, relieve the pressure, buy the ecosystem time. But the proposal hit an immediate wall. The same closure order that protected the species from commercial fishing also prevented any sanction removal. The regulation designed to save the crabs was now trapping them in the conditions killing them. It was a bureaucratic paradox with a body count measured in billions of animals. And somewhere on the ocean floor, the dying was still ongoing. By late 2023, federal managers had no clean options left, only difficult ones. The emergency regulatory review that had been stalled for months finally produced a framework, a limited, strictly monitored research harvest authorized in the most critically overcrowded zones. Not a commercial season, a surgical intervention. Selected vessels, defined coordinates, hard catch limits with real-time reporting requirements. It was an approach that had never been attempted at this scale in American waters, and nobody was certain it would work. The first research vessels returned with data that was simultaneously encouraging and deeply sobering. Crab density in the targeted zones had dropped measurably. Seafloor invertebrate communities in adjacent areas were showing early signs of stabilization. The pressure in those specific locations was beginning to lift, but the cold pool hadn't returned. The bottom temperatures hadn't reversed. The thermal conditions that had triggered the entire cascade were still present, still shifting, which meant the intervention hadn't solved the problem. It had managed one symptom of a much larger illness. The researchers who had spent years inside this crisis were careful with their language in their final reports. They didn't use the word recovery. They used the word monitoring. There is a significant difference between those two words. One implies the worst is over. The other implies you are still watching something that isn't finished. Alaska's fishermen understood that difference better than anyone. Some had already left the industry permanently. Others were waiting, watching the water, reading the surveys, hoping the cold would return. The Bering Sea had always been unforgiving, but this was something new. A reminder that ecosystems don't send warnings before they restructure. They simply change, and everything that depended on the old version is left to adapt or disappear. If stories like this one matter to you, consider subscribing. There are more of them, and most of them are still unfolding.